Section 12 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 3, Ancient Achievements, by John Lord. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. Material Life of the Ancients, Part 1. Mechanical and Useful Arts, 4000 to 50 B.C. While the fine arts made great progress among the cultivated nations of antiquity, and with the Greeks reached a refinement that has never since been surpassed, the ancients were far behind modern nations in everything that has utility for its object. In implements of war, in agricultural instruments, in the variety of manufactures, in machinery, in chemical compounds, in domestic utensils, in grand engineering works, in the comfort of houses, in modes of land travel and transportation, in navigation, in the multiplication of books, in triumphs over the forces of nature, in those discoveries and invention which abridge the labors of mankind and bring races into closer intercourse, especially by such wonders as are wrought by steam, gas, electricity, gunpowder, the mariner's compass, and the art of printing, the modern world feels its immense superiority to all the ages that have gone before. And yet, considering the infancy of science and the youth of nations, more was accomplished by the ancients for the comfort and convenience of luxury of man than we naturally might suppose. Egypt was the primeval seat of what may be called material civilization, and many arts and inventions were known there when the rest of the world was still in ignorance and barbarism. More than 4000 years ago the Egyptians had chariots of war and most of the military weapons known afterward to the Greeks, especially the spear and bow, which were the most effective offensive weapons known to antiquity or the Middle Ages. Some of their warriors were clothed in coats of brass equal to the steel or iron cuirass worn by the medieval knights of chivalry. They had the battle axe, the shield, the sword, the javelin, the metal-headed arrow. One of the early Egyptian kings marched against his enemies with 600,000 infantry, 20,000 cavalry, and 23,000 chariots of war, each drawn by 2 horses. The saddles and bridles of their horses were nearly as perfect as ours are at the present time. The leather they used was dyed in various colors and adorned with metal edges. The wheels of their chariots were bound with hoops of metal and had 6 spokes. Umbrellas to protect from the rays of the sun were held over the heads of their women of rank when they rode in their highly decorated chariots. Walls of solid masonry, thick and high, surrounded their principal cities, while an attacking or besieging army used movable towers. Their disciplined troops advanced to battle in true military precision at the sound of the trumpet. The public works of Egyptian kings were on a grand scale. They united rivers with seas by canals which employed hundreds of thousands of workmen. They transported heavy blocks of stone, of immense weight and magnitude, for their temples, palaces, and tombs. They erected obelisks in single shafts nearly 100 feet in height, and they engraved the sides of these obelisks from top to bottom with representations of warriors, priests, and captives. They ornamented their vast temples with sculptures which required the hardest metals. Rameses the Great, the Sesostris of the Greeks, had a fleet of 400 vessels in the Arabian Gulf, and the rowers wore quilted helmets. His vessels had sails, which implies the weaving of flax and the twisting of heavy ropes. Some of his war galleys were propelled by 44 oars, and were 120 feet in length. Among their domestic utensils, the Egyptians used the same kind of buckets for wells that we find to day among the farmhouses of New England. Skilful gardeners were employed in ornamenting grounds and in raising fruits and vegetables. The leather cutters and dressers were famous for their skill, as well as workers in linen. Most products of the land, as well as domestic animals, were sold by weight in carefully adjusted scales. Instead of coins, money was in rings of gold, silver, and copper. The skill used by the Egyptians in rearing fowls, geese, and domestic animals greatly surpassed that known to modern farmers. According to Wilkinson, they caught fish in nets equal to the seines employed by modern fishermen. Their houses as well as their monuments were built of brick, and were sometimes 4 or 5 stories in height, and secured by bolts on the doors. Locks and keys were also in use, made of iron, and the doorways were ornamented. Some of the roofs of their public buildings were arched with stone. In their mills for grinding wheat, circular stones were used, resembling in form those now employed, generally turned by women, but sometimes so large that asses and mules were employed in the work. The walls and ceilings of their buildings were richly painted, the devices being as elaborate as those of the Greeks. Besides town houses, the rich had villas and gardens, where they amused themselves with angling and spearing fish in the ponds. The gardens were laid in walks shaded with trees, and were well watered from large tanks. Vines were trained on trellis work supported by pillars, and sometimes in the form of bowers. For gathering fruits, baskets were used somewhat similar to those now employed. Their wine presses showed considerable ingenuity, and after the necessary fermentation the wine was poured into large earthen jars, corresponding to the amphorae of the Romans, and covered with lids made air-tight by resin and bitumen. The Egyptians had several kinds of wine, highly praised by the ancients, and wine among them was cheap and abundant. Egypt was also renowned for drugs unknown to other nations, and for beer made of barley, as well as wine. As for fruits, they had the same variety as we have at the present day, their favorite fruit being dates. So fond were the Egyptians of trees and flowers that they exacted a contribution from the nations tributary to them of their rarest plants, so that their gardens bloomed with flowers of every variety in all seasons of the year. Wreaths and chaplets were in common use from the earliest antiquity. It was in their gardens, abounding with vegetables as well as with fruits and flowers, that the Egyptians entertained their friends. In Egyptian houses were handsome chairs and fauteuils, stools and couches, the legs of which were carved in imitation of the feet of animals, and these were made of rare woods, inlaid with ivory, and covered with rich stuffs. Some of the Egyptian chairs were furnished with cushions and covered with the skins of leopards and lions. The seats were made of leather, painted with flowers. Footstools were sometimes made of elegant patterns, inlaid with ivory and precious woods. Mats were used in the sitting rooms. The couches were of every variety of form, and utilized in some instances as beds. The tables were round, square, and oblong, and were sometimes made of stone and highly ornamented with carvings. Bronze bedsteads were used by the wealthy classes. In their entertainments nothing was omitted by the Egyptians which would produce festivity: music, songs, dancing, and games of chance. The guests arrived in chariots or palanquins borne by servants on foot, who also carried parasols over the heads of their masters. Previous to entering the festive chamber, water was brought for the feet and hands, the ewers employed being made often of gold and silver, of beautiful form and workmanship. Servants and attendants anointed the head with sweet-scented ointment from alabaster vases, and put around the heads of the guests garlands and wreaths in which the lotus was conspicuous. They also perfumed the apartments with myrrh and frankincense, obtained chiefly from Syria. Then wine was brought, and emptied into drinking cups of silver or bronze, and even of porcelain, beautifully engraved, one of which was exclusively reserved for the master of the house. While at dinner, the party were enlivened with musical instruments, the chief of which were the harp, the lyre, the guitar, the tambourine, the pipe, the flute, and the cymbal. Music was looked upon by the Egyptians as an important science, and was diligently studied and highly prized. The song and dance were united with the sounds of musical instruments. Many of the ornamented vases and other vessels used by the Egyptians in their banquets were not inferior in elegance of form and artistic finish to those made by the Greeks at a later day. The Pharaoh of the Jewish Exodus had drinking vessels of gold and silver, exquisitely engraved and ornamented with precious stones. Some of the bronze vases found at Thebes and other parts of Egypt show great skill in the art of compounding metals, and were highly polished. Their bronze knives and daggers had an elastic spring, as if made of steel. Wilkinson expresses his surprise at the porcelain vessels recently discovered, as well as admiration of them, especially of their rich colors and beautiful shapes. There is a porcelain bowl of exquisite workmanship in the British Museum, inscribed with the name of Rameses II, proving that the arts of pottery were carried to great perfection 2000 years before Christ. Boxes of elaborate workmanship, made of precious woods finely carved and inlaid with ivory, are also preserved in the different museums of Europe, all dating from a remote antiquity. These boxes are of every form, with admirably fitting lids, representing fishes, birds, and animals. The rings, bracelets, and other articles of jewelry that have been preserved show great facility on the part of the Egyptians in cutting the hardest stones. The skill displayed in the sculptures on the hard obelisks and granite monuments of Egypt was remarkable, since they were executed with hardened bronze. Glass blowing was another art in which the Egyptians excelled. 1500 years before Christ they made ornaments of glass, and glass vessels of large size were used for holding wine. Such was their skill in the manufacture of glass that they counterfeited precious stones with a success unknown to the moderns. We read of a counterfeited emerald 6 feet in length. Counterfeited necklaces were sold at Thebes which deceived strangers. The uses to which glass was applied were in the manufacture of bottles, beads, mosaic work, and drinking cups, and their different colors show considerable knowledge of chemistry. The art of cutting and engraving stones was doubtless learned by the Israelites in their sojourn in Egypt. So perfect were the Egyptians in the arts of cutting precious stones that they were sought by foreign merchants, and they furnished an important material in commerce. From the earliest times the Egyptians were celebrated for their manufacture of linen, which was one of the principal articles of commerce, and cotton and woolen cloths as well as linen were woven. Cotton was used not only for articles of dress, but for the covering of chairs and other kinds of furniture. The great mass of the mummy cloths is of coarse texture, but the fine linen spoken of in the Scripture was as fine as muslin, in some instances containing more than 500 threads to an inch, while the finest productions of the looms of India have only 100 threads to the inch. Not only were the threads of linen cloth of extraordinary fineness, but the dyes were equally remarkable, and were unaffected by strong alkalis. Spinning was principally the occupation of women, who also practised the art of embroidery, in which gold thread was used, supposed to be beaten out by the hammer; but in the arts of dyeing and embroidery the Egyptians were surpassed by the Babylonians, who were renowned for their cloths of various colors. The manufacture of paper was another art for which the Egyptians were famous, made from the papyrus, a plant growing in the marshland of the Nile. The papyrus was also applied to the manufacture of sails, baskets, canoes, and parts of sandals. Some of the papyri, on which is hieroglyphic writing, dating from 2000 years before our era, are in good preservation. Sheepskin parchment was also used for writing. The Egyptians were especially skilled in the preparation of leather for sandals, shields, and chairs. The curriers used the same semicircular knife which is now in use. The great consumption of leather created a demand far greater than could be satisfied by the produce of the country, and therefore skins from foreign countries were imported as part of the tribute laid on conquered nations or tribes. More numerous than the tanners in Egypt were the potters, among whom the pottery wheel was known from a remote antiquity, previous to the arrival of Joseph from Canaan, and long before the foundation of the Greek Athens. Earthenware was used for holding wine, oils, and other liquids, but the finest production of the potter were the vases, covered with a vitreous glaze and modelled in every variety of forms, some of which were as elegant as those made later by the Greeks, who excelled in this department of art. Carpenters and cabinet makers formed a large class of Egyptian workmen for making coffins, boxes, tables, chairs, doors, sofas, and other articles of furniture, frequently inlaid with ivory and rare woods. Veneering was known to these workmen, probably arising from the scarcity of wood. The tools used by the carpenters, as appear from the representations on the monuments, were the axe, the adze, the hand saw, the chisel, the drill, and the plane. These tools were made of bronze with the handles of acacia, tamarisk, and other hard woods. The hatchet, by which trees were felled, was used by boat builders. The boxes and other articles of furniture were highly ornamented with inlaid work. Boat building in Egypt also employed many workmen. Boats were made of the papyrus plant, deal, cedar, and other woods, and were propelled both by sails and oars. One ship of war built for Ptolemy Philopater is said by ancient writers to have been 478 feet long, to have had 40 banks of oars, and to have carried 400 sailors, 4,000 rowers, and 3,000 soldiers. This is doubtless an exaggeration, but indicates great progress in naval architecture. The construction of boats varied according to the purpose for which they were intended. They were built with ribs as at the present day, with small keels, square sails, with spacious cabins in the center, and ornamented sterns. There was usually but one mast, and the prows terminated in the heads of animals. The boats of burden were somewhat similar to our barges; the sails were generally painted with rich colors. The origin of boat building was probably the raft, and improvement followed improvement until the ship of war rivaled in size our largest vessels, while Egyptian merchant vessels penetrated to distant seas, and probably doubled the Cape of Good Hope. In regard to agriculture, the Egyptians were the most advanced of the nations of antiquity, since the fertility of their soil made the occupation one of primary importance. Irrigation was universally practiced, the Nile furnishing water for innumerable canals. The soil was often turned up with the hoe rather than the plow. The grain was sown broadcast and was trodden in by goats. Their plow was very simple and was drawn by oxen, the yoke being attached to the horns. Although the soil was rich, manures were frequently used. The chief crops were those of wheat, barley, beans, peas, lentils, vetches, lupines, clover, rice, indigo, cotton, lettuce, flax, hemp, cumin, coriander, poppy, melons, cucumbers, onions, and leeks. We do not read of carrots, cabbages, beets, or potatoes, which enter so largely into modern husbandry. Oil was obtained from the olive, the castor berry, simsin, and coleseed. Among the principal trees which were cultivated were the vine, olive, locust, acacia, date, sycamore, pomegranate, and tamarisk. Grain after harvest was trodden out by oxen, and the straw was used as provender. To protect the fields from inundation, dikes were built. All classes in Egypt delighted in the sports of the field, especially in the hunting of wild animals, in which the arrow was most frequently used. Sometimes the animals were caught in nets and enclosed places near water brooks. The Egyptians also had numerous fish ponds, since they were as fond of angling as they were of hunting. Hunting in Egypt was an amusement, not an occupation, as among nomadic people. Not only was hunting for pleasure a great amusement among Egyptians, but also among Babylonians and Persians, who coursed the plains with dogs. They used the noose or lasso also to catch antelopes and wild cattle, which were hunted with lions. The bow used in the chase was similar to that employed in war. All the subjects of the chase were sculptured on the monuments with great spirit and fidelity, especially the stag, the ibex, the porcupine, the wolf, the hare, the lion, the fox, and the giraffe. The camel is not found among Egyptian sculptures, nor the bear. Of the birds found in their sculptures were vultures, eagles, kites, hawks, owls, ravens, larks, swallows, turtle doves, quails, ostriches, storks, plovers, snipes, geese, and ducks, many of which were taken in nets. The Nile and Lake Birket el Khouran furnished fish in great abundance. The profits of the fisheries were enormous, and were farmed out by the government. The Egyptians were very fond of ornaments in dress, especially the women. They paid great attention to their sandals; they wore their hair long and plaited, bound round with an ornamented fillet fastened by a lotus bud; they wore earrings and a profusion of rings on the fingers and bracelets for the arms, made of gold and set with precious stones. The scarabaeus, or sacred beetle, was the adornment of rings and necklaces; even the men wore necklaces and rings and chains. Both men and women stained the eyelids and brows. Pins and needles were among the articles of the toilet, usually made of bronze; also metallic mirrors, finely polished. The men carried canes or walking sticks, the wands of Moses and Aaron. As the Egyptians paid great attention to health, physicians were held in great repute, and none were permitted to practice but in some particular branch, such as diseases of the eye, the ear, the head, the teeth, and the internal maladies. They were paid by the government, and were skilled in the knowledge of drugs. The art of curing diseases originated, according to Pliny, in Egypt. Connected with the healing art was the practice of embalming dead bodies, which was carried to great perfection. In elegance of life the Greek and Romans, however, far surpassed any of the nations of antiquity, if not in luxury itself, which was confined to the palaces of kings. In social refinements the Greeks were not behind any modern nation, as one infers from reading Becker's Characles. Among the Greeks was the network of trades and professions, as in Paris and London, and a complicated social life in which all the amenities known to the modern world were seen, especially in Athens and Corinth and the Ionian capitals. What could be more polite and courteous than the intercourse carried on in Greece among cultivated and famous people? When were symposia more attractive than when the élite of Athens, in the time of Pericles, feasted and communed together? When was art ever brought in support of luxury to greater perfection? We read of libraries and booksellers, of social games, of attractive gardens and villas, as well as of baths and spectacles, of markets and fora in Athens. The common life of a Pericles or a Cicero differed but little from that of modern men of rank and fortune. In describing the various arts which marked the nations of antiquity, we cannot but feel that in a material point of view the ancient civilization in its important features was as splendid as our own. In the decoration of houses, in social entertainments, in cookery, the Romans were our equals. The mosaics, the signet rings, cameos, bracelets, bronzes, vases, couches, banqueting tables, lamps, colored glass, potteries, all attest great elegance and beauty. The tables of Thuga root and Delian bronze were as expensive as modern sideboards, Wood and ivory were carved in Rome as exquisitely as in Japan and China. Mirrors were made of polished silver. Glass cutters could imitate the colors of precious stones so well that the Portland vase, from the tomb of Alexander Severus, was long considered as a genuine sardonyx. The palace of Nero glittered with gold and jewels; perfumes and flowers were showered from ivory ceilings. The halls of Heliogabalus were hung with cloth of gold, enriched with jewels; his beds were silver, and his tables of gold. A banquet dish of Drusillus weighed 500 pounds of silver. Tunics were embroidered with the figures of various animals; sandals were garnished with precious stones; Paulina wore jewels, when she paid visits, valued at $800,000. Drinking cups were engraved with scenes from the poets; libraries were adorned with busts and presses of rare woods; sofas were inlaid with tortoise shell and covered with gorgeous purple. The Roman grandees rode in gilded chariots, bathed in marble baths, dined from the golden plate, drank from crystal cups, slept on beds of down, reclined on luxurious couches, wore embroidered robes, and were adorned with precious stones. They ransacked the earth and the seas for rare dishes for their banquets, and ornamented their houses with carpets from Babylon, onyx cups from Bithynia, marble from Numidia, bronzes from Corinth, statues from Athens, whatever, in short, was precious or rare or curious in the most distant countries. What a concentration of material wonders was to be seen in all the countries that bordered on the Mediterranean, not merely in Italy and in Greece, but in Sicily and Asia Minor, and even in Gaul and Spain. Every country was dotted with cities, villas, and farms. Every country was famous for oil, or fruit, or wine, or vegetables, or timber, or flocks, or pasture, or horses. More than 250 cities or towns in Italy alone are historical, and some were famous. The excavations of Pompeii attest great luxury and elegance of life. Cortona, Clusium, Veii, Ancona, Ostia, Praeneste, Antium, Misenum, Baiae, Puteoli, Neapolis, Brundusium, Sybaris were all celebrated. And still more remarkable were the old capitals of Greece, Asia Minor, and Africa. Syracuse was older than Rome, and had a fortress of 1.5 miles in length. Carthage, under the emperors, nearly equalled its ancient magnificence. Athens was never more splendid than in the time of the Roman Antonines. In spite of successive conquests, there still towered upon the Acropolis the most wonderful temple of antiquity, built of Pentelic marble, and adorned with the sculptures of Phidias. Corinth was richer and more luxurious than Athens, and possessed the most valuable pictures of Greece, as well as the finest statues. A single street for 3 miles was adorned with costly edifices. And even the islands which were colonized by Greeks were seats of sculpture and painting, as well as of schools of learning. Still grander were the cities of Asia Minor. Antioch had a street 4 miles in length, with double colonnades, and its baths, theatres, museums, and temples excited universal admiration. At Ephesus was the grand temple of Diana, 4 times as large as the Parthenon at Athens, covering as much ground as Cologne Cathedral, with 128 columns 60 feet high. The Ephesian theatre was capable of seating 60,000 spectators. Tarsus, the birthplace of Saul, was no mean city, and Damascus, the old capital of Syria, was both beautiful and rich. Laodicea was famous for tapestries, Hierapolis for its ironwares, Sybara for its dyes, Sardis for its wines, Smyrna for its beautiful monuments, Delos for its slave trade, Cyrene for its horses, Paphos for its temple of Venus, in which were 100 altars. Seleucia on the Tigris had a population of 400,000. Caesarea in Palestine, founded by Herod the Great, and the principal seat of government to the Roman prefects, had a harbor equal in size to the renowned Piraeus, and was secured against the southwest winds by a mole of such massive construction that the blocks of stone sunk under the water were 50 feet in length, 18 in width, and 9 in thickness. The city itself was constructed of polished stone, with an agora, a theatre, a circus, a praetorium, and a temple to Caesar. Tyre, which had resisted for 7 months the armies of Alexander, remained to the fall of the empire a great emporium of trade. It monopolized the manufacture of imperial purple. Sidon was equally celebrated for its glass and embroidered robes. The Sidonians cast glass mirrors, and imitated precious stones. But the glory of both Tyre and Sidon was in ships which visited all the coasts of the Mediterranean, and even penetrated to Britain and India. But greater than Tyre or Antioch or any Eastern city was Alexandria, the capital of Egypt. Egypt, even in its decline, was still a great monarchy, and when the sceptre of 300 kings passed from Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemies, to Augustus Caesar, the conqueror at Actium, the military force of Egypt is said to have amounted to 700,000 men. The annual revenues of this state under the Ptolemies amounted to about $17,000,000 in gold and silver, besides the produce of the earth. A single feast cost Philadelphus more than £500,000 sterling, and he had accumulated treasures to the amount of 740,000 talents, or about $860,000,000. What European monarch ever possessed such a sum? The kings of Egypt, even when tributary to Rome, were richer in gold and silver than was Louis XIV. in the proudest hour of his life. End of section 12.